When my mother handed me a predatory marketing application as a gift, I smiled because I knew her fantasy world was going to end in hours. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for as far back as my memory stretches, our annual summer retreats haven't been about bonding or relaxation. They've been a battlefield, a psychological game directed entirely by my mother. Every single July, she transformed our family gathering into a theatrical production, a meticulously curated stage where she cast herself as the ultimate benevolent matriarch. For my younger brother and sister, these summer banquets meant receiving massive envelopes of seed money and lavish praise. My mother would proudly announce their mediocre accomplishments to the extended family, handing them checks for European backpacking trips, luxury apartment deposits, or fake startup ventures. My brother once got a fully funded year abroad just for barely passing his freshman finals. For me, the toasts were never just insulting. They were designed to crush my spirit. A pamphlet for a community college remedial class, a jar of loose change to start a savings habit, or applications for minimum wage mall jobs. When I was 17, she dramatically presented me with a brochure for a strict military discipline camp, even though I was an honor roll student. I remember sitting there, clutching that glossy pamphlet, while my siblings waved their five-figure checks. My mother beamed at the patio of guests, waiting for my gratitude. Relatives would stare at their potato salad, coughing awkwardly, pretending the blatant cruelty was just a quirky family joke. If I dared to show even a flicker of hurt, she had her favorite weapon ready. "You need tough love to survive the real world," she would announce over the clinking glasses. "I'm building your character." If I nodded and swallowed my pride, I was finally showing some grit. If my eyes watered, I was fragile and doomed to fail. She held all the cards. My dad just grilled the burgers, avoiding eye contact and whispering later that I shouldn't rock the boat. The minute I finished high school, I engineered my exit. I worked night shifts, saved every tip, and vanished the moment I could secure a tiny studio lease. I stopped attending the July retreats, blaming heavy college workloads and unpaid internships. Slowly, I built a quiet, successful life, a thriving career, my sanctuary, a mind free of her poison. Then the psychological warfare resumed. "You're shattering this family's traditions," my mother would sob over voicemails. "Your siblings are devastated. Are you really this vindictive?" She chipped away at my resolve. I foolishly let myself believe that a decade apart might have softened her. I agreed to attend the 30th annual summer banquet. It was a colossal mistake. The backyard was as pretentious as ever. Catered waitstaff, string lights, a table displaying my siblings' latest fabricated triumphs. My mother hugged me, but her grip felt like a vice. The toast began. My sister got a down payment for a condo. My brother received a massive check to expand his portfolio. When the spotlight hit me, my mother handed me a plastic folder with a sickeningly sweet smile. Inside was a printed application for a predatory multi-level marketing scheme, with a sticky note that read, "For when your little hobby job falls through." I stared at the cheap paper. The entire patio went dead silent, waiting for the explosion. Cousins exchanging nervous glances, bracing for the inevitable screaming match. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I simply smiled, tucked the offensive paper back into its folder, thanked her for looking out for me, and took a slow sip of my wine. The disappointment in her eyes was palpable. She desperately wanted me to crack, to lash out, to storm off into the night. She needed me to play the role of the unstable, ungrateful daughter, so she could deliver her famous speech about tough love. I had already won, though. Over the past 5 years, I hadn't just been working a hobby job. I had built a highly lucrative logistics firm from the ground up. I was completely financially bulletproof, operating entirely under the radar. Meanwhile, my mother had been drowning in the illusion of wealth. She leased cars she couldn't afford, wore jewelry she had to return the next morning, and threw these extravagant summer galas entirely on maxed-out credit lines. She had built a kingdom out of playing cards, and I had started noticing the wind picking up. I knew this because of a spectacular twist of fate 2 weeks prior. My company had recently acquired a smaller accounting firm to handle our expanding payroll. While reviewing their high-risk client files with my new CFO, a very familiar name popped up under a massive IRS fraud investigation. My mother hadn't just been living slightly beyond her means. She had been systematically siphoning tens of thousands of dollars from the local historical society she chaired to fund her lavish lifestyle, and the federal audit was days away from going totally public. The walls were already caving in, and she was entirely out of options. The white wine tasted warm and slightly sour as I swallowed it, but I kept the smile plastered on my face. My mother stood there for an extra 3 seconds, her hand hovering in the air where she had just dropped the folder onto my lap. Her fingers were heavily manicured, a deep, aggressive red that matched the silk wrap dress she had bought specifically to outshine everyone else at her own party. She wanted a reaction. The silence of the backyard stretched out until it became a physical pressure, the kind where you can hear the ice melting in the punch bowl across the patio. "Well," she said, her voice dropping an octave into that practiced theatrical, disappointed tone she used whenever I didn't give her a circus. "I thought you'd be glad to have a fallback plan, Nora. Given how unstable the independent market is these days, we can't all rely on small-scale operations to pay a mortgage forever." My sister Chloe chuckled into her champagne flute. She was 24, sitting on the edge of her seat with her brand new condo paperwork resting next to her plate like a trophy. She hadn't even looked at the layout of the place yet, but she loved the weight of the paper. My brother Julian was already texting under the table, his thumb flying across the screen, probably moving the portfolio expansion money into whatever speculative tech stock his friends were hyping up this week. Neither of them looked at me. They never did during these moments. It was safer to watch the predator eat someone else. "I appreciate the thought, Mom," I said, my voice steady, conversational, completely devoid of the shaky breath she was listening for. "It's always good to have options." I set the folder on the grass beside my chair, not even bothering to place it on the linen-covered table. That small movement, treating her grand insult like a piece of stray trash, made her left eyebrow twitch. It was a tiny victory, but it was enough to sustain me through the next hour of agonizing small talk. The dinner moved forward in its usual exhausting rhythm. The hired caterers, 2 college-age kids who looked like they wanted to swallow their own tongues from the sheer awkwardness of our family dynamic, moved around the long table clearing plates of half-eaten cedar plank salmon. My dad stayed at the far end, his shirt stained with grease from the grill, pouring himself a third glass of scotch. He looked old, not just aged, but worn thin, like a piece of fabric that had been washed too many times until you could see the light right through the threads. He kept his eyes fixed on the string lights hanging from the cedar pergola, entirely absent from the conversation. Around 9 o'clock, the temperature started to drop, the damp summer air settling into the grass. The extended family, a collection of aunts, uncles, and second cousins who only showed up because my mother promised premium alcohol and top-tier catering, began filtering toward the driveway. They made their polite excuses, kissing my mother's cheek and telling her it was the event of the season, as if they were attending a gala at the Met rather than a backyard dinner in a suburban cul-de-sac. I stayed behind, deliberately waiting by the edge of the brick patio under the pretense of finishing my wine. I watched my mother walk her sister to her car, her laughter carrying across the manicured lawn, loud and performative. She was still riding the high of the performance, still believing she was the center of our little universe. When she walked back up the stone steps, her heels clicking sharply against the slate, she noticed me standing there alone. The smile dropped off her face instantly, replaced by that cold, evaluating squint reserved for the staff at the grocery store or me. "I'm surprised you haven't slunk away yet," she said, crossing her arms over her silk dress. The evening breeze was picking up, and without the audience, she looked smaller, colder. Usually, by this point point in the evening, you've made some grand exit because your feelings were hurt. My feelings are fine, Mom, I said, leaning against the iron railing. I actually wanted to talk to you for a second, without the crowd. She sighed, a long, dramatic exhalation that was supposed to convey how exhausting it was to deal with me. Nora, if this is about the application, I don't want to hear it. I am trying to help you. The world doesn't care about your little shipping logistics project. You're 28. You don't have a house, you don't have a partner, and you live in a rented block downtown. You need structure. You need a real business model, not whatever freelance nonsense you've been clinging to. The sheer irony of her words was almost comical. The little shipping logistics project she was dismissing currently held contracts with 3 regional manufacturing plants and ran a fleet of 16 medium-duty trucks. My net revenue from the previous quarter alone could have bought her house twice over cash, but I had spent 5 years keeping my name off the local business registries, using a holding company managed out of Delaware to shield my personal life from her radar. I knew exactly what happened when my mother found out someone had money. She became a tick, burrowing in until she found a vein. It's not about the application, I said quietly. I reached into my purse, pulled out a small folded piece of white paper. Not a check, not an application, just a single page of printed text from a preliminary financial audit ledger, and held it out to her. It's about this. She didn't take it at first. She stared at my hand as if I were holding a dead spider. What is that? Just read it. She snatched it from my fingers with a sharp snap of her wrist, unfolding it under the yellow glow of the patio light. I watched her face carefully. For the first 2 seconds, her expression was pure annoyance, the look of a woman being forced to read a grocery receipt. Then her eyes hit the third line, the line detailing the specific routing numbers from the Fairfield County Historical Society's operating account into a private personal checking account registered under her maiden name. The color didn't just drain from her face. It seemed to sink entirely into her neck. Her mouth opened slightly, her lips dry, the red lipstick suddenly looking garish against her gray skin. Where did you get this? She whispered, her voice losing all of its theatrical resonance. It was thin now, sharp and terrified. We bought Miller & Associates last month, I said, my tone completely flat, the voice I used when negotiating bulk fuel rates with corporate suppliers. The accounting firm. They've been doing the back-end book for the Historical Society for 12 years. When my team started migrating their high-risk archives into our central system, this file flagged automatically. You've been cutting checks to yourself since 2023, Mom. 54 separate transactions, totaling just over $82,000. She scrambled, her brain visibly frantic, trying to find the script for this scenario. But there was no script. She had never been caught before. It's a mistake, she stammered, stepping back until her heel hit the base of a potted fern. It's a deferred compensation structure. For my volunteer hours, the board approved it. We had a verbal agreement. There is no verbal agreement that covers moving public charity funds into a personal account named LM Event Management. Mom, I interrupted, stepping closer. The IRS forensic team has already requested the physical ledgers from Miller's office. They sent the formal notice on Tuesday. Because we own the firm now, that notice came to my desk first. The actual field agents are scheduled to show up at the society's office next Friday morning at 9. She looked down at the paper, her hands shaking so hard the page rattled like dry leaves. Nora, you have to fix this. You own the firm. Just delete it. Clear system. You can just tell them it was an administrative error. That's not how federal audit work, I said. And even if I could, why would I? To save the family tradition. She looked up at me, and for the first time in my entire life, there was no contempt in her eyes. There was only the raw, ugly panic of a woman who realized the stage she had built was made of rotten wood, and she was about to fall straight through the floor. She reached out, her fingers catching the sleeve of my jacket, her grip tight and desperate. Nora, please. You don't understand. The lifestyle, your father's pension didn't cover the renovations. The landscaping alone was $20,000. If people find out, if the board sees this, I'll lose everything. The house, the committee, my reputation. Chloe's condo deposit came from that account, Nora. If they dig into the transfers, they'll take her place too. It will ruin her before she even starts. I looked down at her hand on my arm. The silk of her dress was hot on the zipper of my cuff, pulling a tiny thread loose. She didn't care about Chloe. She cared about the fact that she had used stolen money to buy her favorite child's loyalty, and the paper trail led right back to her own bedroom. You should have thought about Chloe before you started writing the checks, I said, pulling my arm away cleanly. I didn't come here to fix your books, Mom. I came here to tell you that I'm not going to be around when the roof caves in. I'm leaving tonight, and I'm blocking your number. You can't do this, she hissed, her terror instantly turning back into a defensive venom, though her voice stayed low, terrified that my dad or Julian might hear through the open kitchen window. I am your mother. I gave you everything. I raised you. You handed me a brochure for a discipline camp while you were buying Julian a trip to Ibiza with stolen money, I said, my voice dropping into a whisper that felt heavier than a shout. You didn't raise me. You used me as a footstool to make yourself feel tall. And now you're going to have to explain to the IRS why your character building exercises required 82 grand from the local museum. I turned on my heel and walked off the brick patio, my boots crunching softly on the gravel driveway. Behind me, I could hear her frantic, muffled footsteps trying to follow, then stopping at the edge of the grass as she realized she couldn't risk my dad seeing her beg. I got into my car, threw the plastic folder with the multi-level marketing application onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark of the suburban street, illuminating the perfect, identical lawns of the neighborhood she had spent her life trying to impress. As I drove toward the highway, the digital clock on my dashboard clicked over to 9:42 p.m. 6 days until Friday. 6 days before the world she had manufactured with such agonizing precision became a crime scene. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't even feel satisfied. I just felt cold, clean air in my lungs for the first time in 10 years. The drive back to the city took 40 minutes of straight, empty asphalt. When I unlocked the door to my apartment, the quietness of the space hit me like a physical relief. No string lights, no caterers, no tense laughter under a cedar pergola. Just my concrete floors, my books, and the hum of the refrigerator. I threw my keys on the counter, sat down on the sofa, and didn't turn on the lamps. I just watched the city lights bounce off the ceiling. By Monday morning, the reality of what was coming began to set in, not as an emotional weight, but as a series of practical logistical problems. My office was on the 4th floor of a renovated warehouse near the docks, a space filled with the smell of old brick, industrial coffee, and the constant low-frequency rumble of our delivery trucks idling in the bay below. At 8:30 a.m., my CFO Marcus walked into my office without knocking. He had 2 thick manila folders under his arm and a travel mug of black coffee that looked like it had been glued to his hand for the last 3 years. Marcus was 52, a man with the posture of a question mark and a mind like a steel trap. He had spent 20 years in corporate forensics before I hired him away with a salary that made his jaw drop. We have a problem with the Miller transition, Marcus said, dropping the folders onto my desk with a heavy thud. He didn't sit down. He just leaned over the wood, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. I didn't blink. The Historical Society file, partially, he said, tapping the top folder with a blunt index finger. The IRS request we received last week wasn't just a routine check on the society's tax-exempt status. It's an expanded summons. They're looking into the firm itself. Miller & Associates has some, let's call them creative accounting practices across several small business accounts in the county. Your mother's little fund routing scheme is just the thread they pulled to unravel the sweater. I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out the window at the container ship sitting in the harbor. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning that because we bought the firm 3 weeks ago, our corporate entity entity is technically the custodian of records for those fraudulent files, Marcus said, his voice dropping into that quiet, gravelly register he used when things were genuinely messy. If we just hand over the digital archives as they are, your mother goes down instantly. That's a given. But the local field office is also going to look at why we acquired Miller right before the audit landed. They're going to look for a connection, Nora. They're going to see your last name on the central registry for our holding company. And they're going to wonder if this logistics firm was used to park any of that missing money. The air in the room suddenly felt very thick. There is no connection. Our books are pristine, Marcus. Every dime we've ever made is accounted for in the bill of lading logs. I know that, he said. You know that. But an ambitious regional auditor from the federal government doesn't care about pristine. They care about a high-profile family conspiracy story that looks great on a promotion review. If they link your name to her investigation, they can freeze our operational accounts during the discovery phase. If our accounts are frozen for even 48 hours, our drivers don't get fuel cards, our trucks don't move. The manufacturing plants cancel their contracts by Wednesday afternoon. I reached out and opened the folder. The first page was a copy of the formal IRS subpoena, stamped with the date from 2 days prior. My mother's name wasn't on the front page, but our corporate parent company, Apex Logistics Solutions, was listed right there in black ink under the disclosure mandate. She didn't just steal from the museum, I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. She put her hands into everything. She's a sloppy amateur who thought she was untouchable because she had tea with the mayor's wife once a month, Marcus muttered, finally sitting down in the chair across from me. But the real issue is your father. He's listed as a co-signatory on the LM Event Management account she used to siphon the cash. Did you know that? I stared at him. My dad? He doesn't even know how to check his email. He hasn't looked at a bank statement since 1995. She handles every single dollar that goes through that house. Doesn't matter, Marcus said simply. His signature is on the bank card from 2022. It's a joint account. Legally, he's just as liable for the wire fraud as she is. If the hammer falls next Friday, they aren't just going to take her car, Nora. They're going to freeze his pension, and they're going to name him as a co-conspirator in the grand jury indictment. I looked down at my desk, my fingers tracing the edge of the mahogany wood. I thought about my dad standing by that grill on Saturday night, grease on his apron, staring at the string lights while his wife handed me an insult wrapped in plastic. He had spent 30 years staying quiet, keeping his head down, ignoring the cruelty because it was easier than fighting her. And now his silence had signed his own name to a federal warrant. Can we separate his name from the corporate disclosure? I asked. Not legally, Marcus said. If we withhold the signature cards from the Miller archive, we're committing obstruction. I won't do that, Nora. I like you and I like this company, but I'm not going to jail for your mother's backyard lighting budget. I'm not asking you to, I said immediately. What are our actual options here? Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. We have 72 hours to file a voluntary disclosure before the formal audit teams arrive. If you go to the field office first as the owner of Apex and the holder of the records, and report the internal discovery fraud within the acquired firm, we clear our corporate name completely. We protect our accounts, our trucks keep moving, and we look like the good guys who cleaned up Miller's mess. And what happens to my dad if I do that? Marcus looked at me for a long time before he spoke. The hum of a forklift loading a pallet into a trailer down in the bay cut through the silence. He gets swept up in the initial net. He'll have to hire his own defense counsel. He'll probably have to testify against her to keep himself out of a federal facility. It's going to be public, it's going to be ugly, and it's going to happen very fast. My phone on the desk started to vibrate, the screen lighting up with a number I hadn't saved but recognized instantly. It was the landline from my parents' house. It buzzed against the wood, shifting an inch to the left with every ring. I didn't pick it up. Marcus watched it shake until it finally cut off, leaving the room silent again. File the voluntary disclosure, Marcus, I said, my voice sounding more tired than I wanted it to. Prepare the documents for my signature by 3 this afternoon. He nodded once, stood up, and took the folders back into his arms. Good choice. It's the only one that keeps the lights on here. When he left, the office felt larger and emptier than before. I didn't do any work for the next hour. I just sat there, watching the dust motes float through the pale morning sun hitting the brick wall. At noon, I took my coat and went down to the street. I didn't want to eat, but I needed to move, needed to escape the smell of the warehouse and the feeling that the walls were narrowing down around my business. I walked 3 blocks down to a small diner that served greasy, overpriced burgers to the dock workers. It was loud, the jukebox in the corner playing some old country song about a guy losing his farm, the air smelling of old frying oil and vinegar. I sat at a small 2-person table near the back door, ordering a coffee I didn't intend to drink. I had just taken the first sip when the bell above the front entrance chimed, and a shape blocked the light from the street. It was Julian. He looked completely out of place in his designer linen shirt and clean white sneakers, his hair perfectly styled despite the humid river breeze. He scanned the diner with an expression of intense discomfort, his nose slightly crinkled, as if he had just stepped into an open sewer. When his eyes found me in the back corner, he didn't hesitate. He walked over quickly, his stride long and agitated, and slid into the vinyl booth across from me without asking. You blocked Mom's number, he said before his coat had even settled against the seat. His voice wasn't angry. It was high, thin, and frantic, the exact tone he used when he was 8 years old and had broken one of my mother's porcelain figures. I told her I would, I said, setting my mug down. How did you find me here, Julian? I called your old office from 3 years ago, and some receptionist told me you had moved down to the docks, he said, leaning across the table, his hands flat on the laminated surface. Nora, what the hell did you say to her on Saturday? She hasn't left her bedroom in 48 hours. She's got the blinds drawn. She won't talk to Dad. And she spent all of yesterday morning burning old bank statements in the backyard grill. The whole house smells like scorched plastic. I looked at my brother. He was 25, but looking at him right then, I realized he had never actually grown up. He had been kept in a greenhouse, watered with stolen money and false praise until he believed he was a rare orchid instead of a weed. Did she tell you why she's burning papers, Julian? I asked quietly. She said you were trying to ruin the family, he hissed, his eyes darting toward the counter where the waitress was wiping down the milkshake machine. She said you found some clerical errors from her historical society work and that you're threatening to use it to embarrass her because you're still bitter about high school. Clerical errors, I repeated. I couldn't help but let out a dry, short laugh. She stole $82,000 from a public charity, Julian. Some of that money went directly into your account last month to expand your portfolio. Did you know that? When you bought those shares, you were using cash that was supposed to preserve the city's 19th century archives. Julian's mouth shut instantly. He didn't look shocked. He looked defensive. His eyes dropped to his hands, his fingers twisting the silver ring on his pinky. She told me it was an advance on my inheritance. She said Grandpa had a trust that finally matured. Grandpa died with $900 in a checking account and a mountain of medical debt, I said, leaning in so the waitress wouldn't hear us over the country music. You knew that. You just didn't want to look too closely at the check because you liked what it bought. That's not fair, he muttered, his face turning a dark blotchy red. I don't know anything about her banking. She handles the money, Nora. If she gave me a gift, why wouldn't I take it? You're the one who went looking for trouble. You bought that accounting firm deliberately, didn't you? Just to spy on her. I bought that firm because we needed to handle our own regional payroll without outsourcing to a third party, I said. The fact that our mother is a federal felon was just an unexpected bonus on the balance sheet. Julian slammed his hand down on the table, making the coffee spoons rattle. She is your mother, Nora. Nora. She's your family. You're talking about her like she's some stranger you're trying to squeeze for a corporate contract. If she goes to jail, what do you think happens to us? Chloe's condo, the bank is already calling her because the initial wire transfer didn't clear the fraud check this morning. She's hysterical. She thinks she's going to lose her earnest money. She is, I said flatly. And Dad might lose his house. Julian froze. What do you mean, Dad? Dad didn't do anything. He signed the papers, Julian. He's on the account. He's the co-owner of LM Event Management. When the IRS files the charges on Friday, his name is going to be right next to hers on the indictment. My brother stared at me, his eyes wide and completely empty of the bravado he had walked in with. He looked like he was trying to compute a math problem that didn't have enough numbers. No, that's you're lying. You're just trying to scare me, so I'll take your side. I don't need you on my side, I said, sliding out of the booth and standing up. I pulled a $5 bill from my pocket and dropped it next to the untouched coffee. I'm signing the corporate disclosure at 3 o'clock today. My company is turning over every digital record Miller and Associates has to the federal government. If you want to save Dad, you better get him out of that house and into a lawyer's office before the weekend, because by Monday, nobody's going to be looking at the garden lights anymore. I didn't wait for him to answer. I walked out into the bright hot noon air, the bell on the door ringing behind me, leaving my brother sitting alone in the grease-stained booth with a $5 bill and a portfolio built on sand. The walk back to the warehouse felt longer this time. The humidity was thick, sticking to my skin under my blazer, and the smell of the river was heavy with diesel and rotting timber. By the time I reached the 4th floor, my administrative assistant, Elena, met me at the door with a pale face. Your father is in your office, she whispered, holding a clipboard against her chest like a shield. He's been sitting there for 20 minutes. He wouldn't let me call you. I stopped. Did he say what he wanted? No, she said. He just asked for a glass of water and sat down. Nora, he looks really sick. I took a breath, smoothed down my jacket, and pushed the door open. My dad was sitting in the visitor's chair by the window. He had taken off his old windbreaker, and it was draped over his lap, his large calloused hands resting on top of the fabric. He wasn't looking at the ships. He was staring at the floor between his feet, his shoulders hunched forward as if he were trying to occupy as little space as possible. Dad, I said softly, closing the door behind me. He flinched slightly, then looked up. The yellow light from the window showed the deep purple bags under his eyes, the gray stubble on his jaw that he hadn't shaved that morning. He looked 70, though he was only 61. Nora, he said, his voice dry and raspy. He reached for the glass of water Elena had given him, took a tiny sip, and set it back down on the edge of my desk with a trembling hand. Your brother called me from some diner. He was screaming. I couldn't make out half of what he was saying, but he mentioned the IRS. He mentioned your name. I walked around the desk and sat down in my chair. For a second, I felt like I was 17 again, sitting on the patio while my mother handed me the discipline camp brochure, waiting for him to say something, anything, to stop it. But this time, the desk was mine. The building was mine. Julian told you the truth, Dad, I said. The Historical Society books are gone. Mom took over $80,000 through a joint account with your name on it. The federal agents are coming on Friday. He didn't yell. He didn't even look surprised. He just let out a long, slow breath through his nose, his head dropping back down toward his hands. I knew there was something. Last winter, she bought those new leather sofas for the formal living room. I asked her where the money came from, and she told me to mind my own business. She said she was doing some consulting work for the city. I knew the city didn't pay volunteers, Nora, but I didn't ask. I just went down to the basement and worked on my lawnmower. The honesty of it was almost worse than a lie. He had traded his safety, his retirement, and his daughter's respect for the privilege of not having to argue with his wife at dinner. Your signature is on the bank card from 2020, Dad, I said, keeping my voice professional, because if I let any emotion into it, I'd start shaking. My firm is filing a voluntary disclosure this afternoon to protect our operations. If we don't, they'll freeze our accounts and kill the business I spent 5 years building. When that file goes over, your name goes with it. He nodded slowly, his fingers gripping the windbreaker on his lap. I know. I'm not mad at you, Nora. You did what you had to do. You always were the only one who could see through her circus. Then why are you here, Dad? He looked up at me, and his eyes were completely watery, the rim of his eyelids red and raw. She wants me to take the blame, Nora. She came into the kitchen after Julian called. She had a whole story mapped out. She wants me to tell the investigators that I took the money for a gambling debt. She said because I'm a retired utility worker with a clean record, they'd give me probation. She said if she goes to jail, the family name is ruined forever. But if I take it, we can say it was a medical issue or an addiction. She's already writing the statement for me to sign. The room seemed to spin slightly. I looked at the man who had raised me, the man who had stood by while I was humiliated year after year, and saw that he was still considering it. He was still considering throwing his entire life into the meat grinder just to keep her from having to face the crowd without her silk dress. Are you going to sign it? I asked, my voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. He looked out the window, his jaw working silently. If I don't, she says she'll leave me. She says she'll take whatever's left of the house equity, move to her sister's place in Vermont, and never speak to me again. Julian and Chloe won't look at me either. She's already told them I've been hiding things from her. She's leveraging you, Dad. She's been leveraging you for 30 years. I leaned across the desk, my knuckles turning white against the wood. If you sign that fake confession, you aren't getting probation. That's wire fraud and grand larceny from a state-funded nonprofit. That's 5 to 7 years in a federal penitentiary. You won't survive 3 months in a place like that, and you know it. She'll be sitting in her sister's house in Vermont drinking Pinot Grigio while you're eating off a tin tray. He shook his head, a single tear finally sliding down the crease of his cheek into his gray stubble. I don't know what to do, Nora. I don't have the money for a big lawyer. My whole pension is tied up in the joint account she used. The bank froze it 2 hours ago. I couldn't even buy gas on the way down here. I had to use the quarters from the ashtray. I looked at him, and the old knot of anger in my chest, the one I had carried since I was 17, suddenly felt hollow. He wasn't the enemy. He was just another piece of timber she had used to build the stage. And now that the fire was starting, he was the one getting scorched first. I reached for my desk phone, dialed the internal line for Marcus's office, and waited for him to pick up. Marcus, I said when his voice came through the line, hold the voluntary disclosure. Don't sign anything yet. Bring the Miller file back to my office, and bring the number for that corporate defense attorney you used during the logistics audit last year. We need to make an appointment for 2 o'clock. I hung up the phone and looked back at my dad. He was watching me with a look of pathetic, desperate hope that made me want to look away. You're not signing anything, she writes, Dad, I said, my voice cold as iron. You're going to stay in my office until 2, and then we're going to see a lawyer who doesn't care about the family name. But you need to understand something right now. If I pay for this, if I help you pull your neck out of her noose, you are done with her. You don't go back to that house. You don't take her calls. You leave her on that patio alone. He stared at me for a long time, the silence stretching between us until the roar of a semi-truck outside broke the spell. He gave a small, miserable nod. Okay, Nora. Okay. But as I looked at him, I could see the doubt behind his eyes, the deep-seated habit of compliance that 30 years of psychological conditioning had worn into his brain. He was agreeing now, under the fluorescent lights of my office with his pension frozen. But I knew the minute he walked out that door, the script would start calling him back. The lawyer's office was located in a concrete high-rise 3 blocks from the county courthouse, a sterile place that smelled of carpet cleaner and expensive stationery. The attorney, a woman named Sarah Vance with sharp silver hair and a gray wool suit that looked like armor, didn't waste time with small talk. She sat behind a glass desk, reviewed the documents Marcus had printed out and looked at my father over the rim of her reading glasses. Your wife has left a remarkably clear trail, Mr. Miller, Vance said, her pen tapping a steady rhythmic beat against the manila folder. The IRS isn't going to need a jury to see what happened here. The transfers from the Historical Society were structured to stay just under the $10,000 mandatory reporting limit for corporate banks, which means she was actively trying to avoid federal tracking. That moves this from simple embezzlement into structured money laundering. My dad sat in the leather chair, his hands clamped tightly over his knees. And my name? On the cards? It complicates things, Vance said directly. The federal government doesn't care about who spent the money. They care about whose authority allowed the money to move. Since you are a co-owner of the LLC she set up for her event management company, you are legally responsible for the filings. If Nora's firm submits this voluntary disclosure this afternoon, the regional director is going to issue a freeze on all assets associated with that LLC. That means your house, which has a home equity line of credit tied directly to that same joint account, will be subject to a federal lien within 48 hours. The house? My dad whispered. He looked at me, his eyes wide. Nora, she's still in the house. She's trying to clear out the safe in the basement. She told me this morning she was going to pack up her mother's silver. If she removes any assets after the lien is filed, that's another felony, Vance said without a trace of sympathy. Now here's what we can do. We can file an innocent spouse relief petition with the IRS concurrently with Nora's corporate disclosure. We argue that you had zero operational control over the finances, that your signature was obtained under false pretenses, and that you derived no direct benefit from the funds. But he did benefit, I interrupted, leaning forward. He lives in the house that the equity line renovated. He ate the food from the catering. His son's college tuition was partially paid out of that account. Will they look at that? They will, Vance admitted, which is why the innocent spouse defense only works if he cooperates fully. That means providing every personal text message, every email, and a full deposition detailing exactly when he realized the money was stolen. And it means he cannot share a residence with the primary target of the investigation while the petition is active. Mr. Miller, if you go back to that house tonight, the IRS will view it as a joint defense. They will assume you are aligning your stories. The room went completely silent. My dad looked down at his shoes, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find air. The choice wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't about not rocking the boat. It was a legal line in the dirt. Stay with his wife and go down with her, or move his things into a motel and watch her get arrested from across town. I can't just leave her there with the agents coming, he muttered, his voice cracking. She doesn't know how to handle. She doesn't have anyone else, Nora. Julian is in a panic, and Chloe won't even pick up her phone because of the condo deposit. If I don't go back, she's entirely alone in that house. She chose to be alone when she started writing checks to herself, Dad, I said, my voice hardening. Sarah, if we file the disclosure today, how much time does he have to move his things before the lien hits? The lien will be recorded by noon on Wednesday, Vance said, checking her watch. It's currently 2:45 p.m. on Monday. He has less than 48 hours to clear out his personal property. Anything left in that house after Wednesday morning becomes part of the seized estate until the investigation concludes. I stood up, pulling my credit card from my wallet and sliding it across the glass desk toward Vance. Retain her services for my father, Sarah. Prepare the innocent spouse petition. We'll file the corporate disclosure from Apex at exactly 4 p.m. My dad didn't move from his chair. He looked at the credit card on the desk, then up at me, his expression a mix of shame and resentment that I recognized all too well. It was the same look he gave me when I was 18 and told him I was moving out because I couldn't stand the sight of him letting her talk to me like trash. He hated me for making the choice he was too weak to make himself. Come on, Dad, I said, reaching down to take his windbreaker from his lap. We're going to get your truck. The drive back to their suburban neighborhood was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. The afternoon sun was high and brutal, baking the asphalt until the air above the highway shimmered with heat. My dad sat in the passenger seat of my car, his head turned toward the window, watching the identical exits pass by. When we turned into the cul-de-sac, the neighborhood looked exactly as it had on Saturday night, except the string lights were gone, leaving only the bare wooden pergola, looking naked and slightly gray in the harsh daylight. My mother's leased luxury SUV was parked in the driveway, angled sharply as if she had parked in a hurry. I'll wait out here, I said, pulling up to the curb 3 houses down. Go in, get your clothes, get your tools from the garage, and come back out. Do not talk to her about the audit. Do not tell her about the lawyer. He didn't answer. He just opened the door, his joints popping loudly in the quiet car, and walked up the concrete driveway. I watched him pull his key out of his pocket, his hand hesitating for 3 long seconds before he turned the lock and pushed the heavy oak front door open. I rolled my window down, the hot sticky air filling the car. From inside the house, even from 3 doors down, I could hear the immediate rise of voices. Not my dad's. He didn't shout, but my mother's. Her voice was high, sharp, carrying through the open windows of the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. Where have you been? She screamed, the words muffled but distinct. The bank said the accounts are locked. They said it's a compliance hold, Richard. What did you do? Did you talk to Nora? Is she doing this? I leaned my head back against the headrest, closing my eyes. I could hear the sound of drawers slamming, the heavy thud of a suitcase being dragged across the hardwood floor upstairs. She wasn't just panicked, she was packing. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The sun shifted behind the oak trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the lawn. I looked at my watch. It was 3:35 p.m. In 25 minutes, Marcus would hit the send button on the Apex disclosure server, and the digital files would land on the desk of the regional director. The front door of the house banged open. My dad came out first, carrying a large black duffel bag that looked like it had been in the attic since the 90s. His face was bright red, his shirt torn slightly at the collar. Behind him came my mother, her silk dress from Saturday night replaced by a pair of expensive sweatpants and an oversized white linen shirt. Her hair was a mess, pulled back into a ragged ponytail. Her face completely free of makeup. Without her paint, she looked 65, her skin loose around her jaw, her eyes small and dark with an erratic, dangerous energy. You're a coward, she shrieked, following him down the driveway as he dragged the duffel bag toward his old pickup truck. You're leaving me because of her? She's a vindictive, hateful little bitch who has wanted to destroy this family since she was a child. You're going to let her tell you what to do? My dad didn't look back at her. He threw the duffel bag into the bed of the truck, the heavy canvas hitting the metal with a loud clatter. He reached into his pocket for his truck keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them onto the asphalt. Richard, she screamed, stepping off the curb, her bare feet hitting the hot pavement. If you walk away from this house today, you are dead to me. Do you hear me? You don't have a penny. You don't have a retirement. I will take everything. She caught sight of my car parked down the street. Her eyes widened, her mouth twisting into a snarl that looked completely unhuman. She didn't look like the elegant matriarch of the Historical Society anymore. She looked like an animal cornered in an alley. She started walking toward me, her stride fast and unstable, her bare feet clicking against the road. You, she shouted, pointing a manicured finger that was still chipped with that deep red polish. You did this. You brought this into my house. I should have sent you to that camp when you were 17. I should have left you on the street. I didn't roll my window up. I just sat there, my hands loose on the steering wheel, watching her approach. Mom, I said, voice completely steady as she reached the side of the car, her hands slamming down onto the hot metal of my door. It's 3:55 p.m. She stopped, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, her face inches from mine. The smell of burning plastic was still faint on her clothes, mixed with the expensive perfume she always wore. What? The disclosure files just went through. I lied, looking at my watch. The Federal Registry predatory has your routing numbers now. You have about 18 hours before the formal freeze notices hit your sister's house in Vermont too, because I know you tried to wire $20,000 to her account this morning. The system flagged it 2 hours ago. She stared at me, the rage in her face suddenly curdling into an absolute hollow vacuum of understanding. Her hands slipped off my door, leaving 2 greasy smudge prints on the clean black paint. She stepped back 1 step, then 2, looking around the quiet suburban cul-de-sac, as if she expected the neighbors to come out and applaud her performance. But every single window remained dark and empty. My dad's truck engine turned over, with a loud rusty roar behind her. He didn't look at her through the rearview mirror. He just shifted into reverse, backed out of the driveway, and drove past my car without stopping, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. I looked at my mother one last time. She was standing in the middle of the street, her white linen shirt blowing slightly in the hot wind, her bare feet gray with road dust. She looked exactly like what she was, a thief whose stage had just burned down around her. I put my car in drive, pulled away from the curb, and left her standing there in the heat, waiting for the weekend to end. The drive back to the city was a blur of highway markers and brake lights. I didn't turn the radio on. I just listened to the hum of the tires on the asphalt, my jaw locked tight. By the time I pulled into my designated parking spot in the underground garage of my building, my hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel. I sat in the dark car for a long time, just breathing the stale garage air, waiting for the adrenaline crash. When it hit, it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like exhaustion, a deep, bone-level tiredness that made my limbs feel like lead. I unlocked my apartment door and threw my keys on the counter. The space was completely silent, the floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city glowing against the night sky. I walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and pulled out a bottle of water. As I unscrewed the cap, my cell phone finally started vibrating against the quartz countertop. It was Chloe. I watched the screen light up, her name flashing over and over. I let it ring out. 10 seconds later, it started buzzing again. She wasn't going to stop. I swiped the green icon and put the phone on speaker, setting it down next to the sink. Nora? Her voice was shrill, panicked, completely devoid of the smug satisfaction she'd worn like a second skin on Saturday night. Nora, are you there? I'm here, Chloe. What the hell did you do? She screamed, the audio clipping from the sheer volume. The escrow officer just called me. My earnest money transfer was reversed. They said the originating account is under federal review. Mom is screaming in the living room, Julian is locked in his bedroom, and Dad's truck is gone. What is going on? Mom didn't tell you, I asked, taking a sip of the cold water. Tell me what? She's just throwing things and saying you betrayed the family. Nora, my realtor is threatening to list the condo back on the market tomorrow morning if the wire doesn't clear. I already bought custom drapes for the living room. You need to call your accounting people and tell them to lift the hold right now. The absolute delusion was almost breathtaking. Even with the house burning down around her, Chloe only cared about the heat ruining her curtains. I can't lift the hold, Chloe, I said, my voice flat. The hold was placed by the Internal Revenue Service. Mom has been stealing money from the Historical Society for over 2 years. The account she used to pay for your condo deposit is a fraudulent shell company. It's gone. The line went dead silent. For 5 seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of my refrigerator. You're lying, she whispered finally. But it wasn't a confident accusation. It was the sound of a child realizing the monster under the bed was real. I'm not. The federal audit starts Friday. The regional director has the files. Dad left because his name is on the account too. And if he stayed in the house, they were going to indict him as a co-conspirator. Mom wouldn't do that, Chloe stammered, her breathing picking up speed. She has money. Grandpa has trust. There is no trust, Chloe. Grandpa died broke. The cars, the caterers, the seed money, your down payment. It's all stolen from a public charity. Every dime. No, she said, her voice rising again, defensive and desperate. No, this is you. This is your fault. You bought that firm. You could have deleted it. You could have just kept your mouth shut and fixed the books. You did this on purpose to ruin my life because you're jealous. Jealous of what? I asked, the sheer absurdity of it making me laugh. A short, dry sound that echoed in the empty kitchen. Your fake apartment? Your fake career? Everything you have is printed on funny money, Chloe. I don't have to be jealous of a ghost. You have to pay for it, she blurted out, her panic overriding whatever was left of her pride. Nora, please. You have money. You have that logistics company. You can wire the deposit to the escrow account tomorrow. Just $50,000. That's nothing to you, right? You can cover it, and I'll pay you back. I promise. If I lose this unit, I have nowhere to go. My lease is up on the 30th. You want me to use my legitimate corporate funds to replace the stolen money you were trying to use to buy a luxury condo? I asked slowly, wanting to make sure she heard exactly how insane she sounded. I'm your sister, she shrieked. You owe me. I don't owe you anything. When Mom handed me a pamphlet for a minimum wage mall job on Saturday, you laughed into your champagne. You liked it when she ground me into the dirt. You liked being the favorite. Well, the favorite has to deal with the fallout. Better call your landlord and ask for an extension. I reached out and ended the call before she could scream again. I blocked her number immediately. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I just felt dirty, like I'd been rolling around in the mud with them. My phone vibrated again almost instantly. I expected another number, maybe Julian this time, but the screen showed a local Connecticut area code. I frowned and picked it up. Hello? Nora? The voice was thick, muffled by the sound of heavy traffic in the background. It was my dad. Nora, it's me. Dad, where are you? Did you get your stuff? I got my clothes, he said, coughing a dry, rattling cough. But I didn't make it very far. I'm at the Sunoco station on Route 9, right off the interstate. The truck, the radiator blew out. Smoke everywhere. I managed to roll it into the lot, but the mechanic here says it needs a whole new cooling system. $600 minimum. I closed my eyes, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Did you try the emergency credit card? I tried it, he said, his voice breaking slightly. It declined. The cashier won't let me use the debit card either. She said the magnetic strip kicked back a fraud code. Nora, they froze everything. The joint accounts, the savings, the credit lines. I only have $20 in cash in my wallet. I can't even afford a room at the Motel 6 down the street. I don't know what to do. He sounded utterly defeated. 30 years of keeping his head down. 30 years of quiet complicity. All leading to him sitting on a curb at a gas station with $20 and a broken truck. Stay there, I said, grabbing my keys off the counter again. Don't try to drive it. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I didn't wait for him to thank me. I hung up, took the elevator down to the garage, and got back into my car. The engine roared to life, loud in the concrete bunker. When I pulled into the Sunoco station, the fluorescent lights under the canopy were humming violently, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked pavement. My dad's old Ford pickup was parked over by the air pump. The hood popped open, a faint wisp of white steam still curling out from the engine block. My dad was sitting on his black duffel bag next to the ice machine. He looked small. He was wearing the same stained windbreaker, his hands resting on his knees, staring blankly at the asphalt between his boots. When my headlight swept over him, he squinted, raising a hand to shield his eyes. I put the car in park and stepped out into the humid night air. It smelled like gasoline and old rain. Put your bag in the trunk, I said, popping the latch. He didn't argue. He heaved the heavy canvas bag over his shoulder, his joints popping loudly, and dropped it into the trunk of my sedan. He walked around to the passenger side and climbed in, sinking into the leather seat. He smelled like sweat, old canvas, and the sharp metallic tang of burnt coolant. What about the truck? I asked, putting the car back in gear. I gave the keys to the kid inside, he muttered, staring out the window at the glowing gas prices on the marquee. Told him he could have the title if he paid the scrap fee. It's not worth fixing anyway. The transmission was slipping all winter. I didn't say anything. I just merged back onto the highway, pointing the car toward the city. The silence in the cabin was heavy, entirely different from the silence I had experienced driving alone. This silence was suffocating, loaded with decades of unspoken resentment and cowardice. She tried to block the driveway, he said suddenly, his voice raspy in the dark car. When I backed out, she stood right behind the tailgate. I had to inch the bumper forward until she finally stepped out of the way. She kept hitting the side of the bed with her fists, dented the quarter panel. She's losing her mind because she's losing her audience, I said, keeping my eyes on the road. Don't mistake panic for heartbreak, Dad. He swallowed hard. Julian called me while I was waiting for you. He was crying. He said Mom locked herself in the master bathroom and won't come out. She took a bottle of wine in there with her. He wanted me to come back and kick the door in. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles ached. You are not going back. I told him I couldn't, my dad said, his voice shrinking. I told him he had to call the police if he thought she was going to hurt herself. He screamed at me. He said I was abandoning the family. He said I was just like you. Good, I said coldly. Maybe if he learns how to survive a week without her holding his hand, he'll finally get a real job. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. When we got to my apartment, I buzzed us into the garage and walked him to the elevator. He looked entirely out of place in the sleek, minimalist lobby of my building. He kept wiping his boots on the entry mat, terrified of tracking dirt onto the polished concrete floors. I unlocked my door and flipped on the lights. The apartment was large, open, and immaculate. The walls were painted a cool slate gray, the furniture modern and low to the ground. My dad stood in the entryway, holding his duffel bag, looking around like he had just stepped onto another planet. He had never been to my apartment. In the 5 years I had lived in the city, neither he nor my mother had ever asked for my address. You can take the guest room down the hall on the right, I said, pointing past the kitchen. There are clean towels in the bathroom across from it. You can stay here until Wednesday. After that, Sarah Vance is going to need you to establish an independent residence to satisfy the IRS requirements for the innocent spouse petition. We'll find you a furnished short-term rental tomorrow. He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the massive windows overlooking the skyline. You did all this yourself, Nora? Yes. I didn't know, he said softly. She always told us you were struggling. She said you were jumping from temp agency to temp agency, living in a basement. She needed me to be struggling, I corrected him. If I was successful, she couldn't play the savior. Go take a shower, Dad. You smell like radiator fluid. He flinched slightly at the bluntness, but he nodded again, shuffling down the hallway. A minute later, I heard the guest room door click shut. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time, watching the headlights of the cars on the bridge moving in slow, rhythmic lines. I had dismantled the lie, but the truth wasn't exactly comforting. I was 28 years old, running a multi-million-dollar company, and I felt like I was running a halfway house for the casualties of my mother's ego. Tuesday morning broke with a dull, gray overcast that threatened rain but couldn't seem to deliver it. I woke up at 5:30, my internal clock refusing to let me sleep past my usual time, despite the exhaustion. I made a pot of black coffee and sat at the kitchen island with my laptop. The guest room door was still shut. I didn't hear a sound from my dad. By 7, I was dressed and ready for the office. I left a note on the counter next to a spare set of keys and a crisp $100 bill I had in my emergency stash. Don't leave the building unless you have to. If you need food, order delivery. Do not call Mom. Do not call Julian. I will be back at 6. When I walked into the Apex Logistics office at 8 o'clock, the atmosphere was already tense. The warehouse below was loud with the morning shift loading the regional trucks, but the administrative floor was dead quiet. Elena was waiting at my desk holding a stack of printed emails. Good morning, I said, dropping my briefcase onto the leather chair. Marcus in yet? He's in the conference room with the legal team, Elena said, her face tight. She handed me the top email. Nora, we have a problem. Not with the IRS, with the local contracts. I took the paper. It was an email from the procurement director of Harrison Manufacturing, one of our largest regional clients. They produced heavy-duty industrial valves, and we handled their entire Northeast shipping corridor. The contract was worth over $2 million annually. The email was a formal notice of suspension. Dear Ms. Miller T. Due to pending compliance and investigations regarding Apex Logistics Solutions and its recent acquisition of Miller and Associates, we are temporarily suspending our shipping contracts effective immediately. Our corporate bylaws prohibit engaging vendors currently under federal audit review. We will require a formal clearance letter from the IRS before we can resume dispatch operation. I stared at the text, the words swimming slightly. The IRS doesn't issue clearance letters mid-investigation, I said out loud, and Apex isn't under audit. We filed a voluntary disclosure as the reporting party. They don't care, a voice said from the doorway. Marcus walked in, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His tie was loose, and he was carrying a massive thermos of coffee. I just got off the phone with Harrison's VP of Operations. They're panicking. Why are they panicking? This has nothing to do with their freight. Marcus shut the door behind him and walked over to my desk. It has everything to do with the Fairfield County Historical Society. Do you know who sits on the board of directors for the society, Nora? I frowned, thinking back to the extravagant galas my mother used to drag the family to when I was a teenager. The men in expensive tuxedos, the women dripping in diamonds they wanted everyone to know were real. Local money, I said. Real estate developers, old money inheritors. And Arthur Harrison, Marcus said grimly, the CEO of Harrison Manufacturing. He's been the treasurer of the Historical Society for the last 6 years. The bottom of my stomach dropped out. Your mother didn't just steal 82 grand in a vacuum, Nora, Marcus explained, leaning over the desk. She was writing those checks directly past Arthur Harrison's desk. He approved the ledgers. He rubber-stamped the deferred compensation structure she claimed she was getting. When your disclosure hit the Federal Registry yesterday afternoon, the IRS didn't just flag your mother. They flagged the entire board of the Historical Society for financial negligence and potential conspiracy to defraud a 501c3. I rubbed my temples, a sharp headache looming right behind my eyes. So Harrison is using his company to punish us for blowing the whistle on his incompetence. Exactly, Marcus said. He knows he looks like an idiot for letting a suburban housewife siphon federal grant money out from under his nose. If the IRS decides he was complicit, he faces massive fines. He's trying to create distance. By suspending our contract, he gets to tell his shareholders that Harrison Manufacturing immediately severed ties with any entity connected to the Miller name the moment fraud was detected. He's throwing us under the bus to sanitize his own reputation. Can he do that legally? The contract has a standard morality and compliance clause, Marcus said, pulling a secondary folder from under his arm. It's vague enough that he can use the federal subpoenas sent to Miller and Associates as grounds for temporary suspension. But it gets worse. Harrison called the other 2 manufacturing plants in the regional consortium this morning. He told them Apex is toxic. They're considering pulling their freight by noon today. I walked over to the window, looking down at the loading bays. 16 trucks, engines running, drivers drinking coffee from styrofoam cups, waiting for dispatch orders. If the consortium pulled their freight, 70% of our weekly revenue vanished instantly. We would bleed cash. We wouldn't be able to make payroll by the end of the month. My mother's kingdom of playing cards wasn't just collapsing on her. The wind was blowing the debris straight into my warehouse. Get Sarah Vance back on the phone, I said, turning around to face Marcus. Tell her I need a cease and desist drafted immediately. And get me Arthur Harrison's direct sell. Nora, threatening a CEO with a lawsuit isn't going to make him put freight back on our trucks, Marcus warned gently. It will just entrench him. I'm not going to threaten him with a lawsuit, I said, walking back to my desk and opening my laptop. I'm going to threaten him with a press release. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Explain. Harrison wants to keep this quiet. He thinks suspending our contract isolates him from the fallout, but he's forgetting who currently holds the physical archives for Miller and Associates. I looked up at my CFO. We still have the original ledgers in our secure server room, right? The ones waiting to be transferred to the the field office on Friday? Yes, but we can't touch them. They're evidence. I don't need to touch them. I just need to read them, I said, my fingers flying over the keyboard. If Arthur Harrison signed off on my mother's fake compensation structure, his signature is on the internal approval memos. If he pulls my freight and tries to bankrupt my company, I will personally hand-deliver copies of those memos to the local business journal before the IRS even gets here on Friday. I'll make sure every shareholder in his company knows their CEO isn't just cutting ties with the vendor. He's actively trying to bury the company that exposed his own financial gross negligence. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his tired face. That is expression, boss. It's aggressive negotiation, I corrected him. Get him on the phone. It took 20 minutes of fighting through executive assistants and administrative roadblocks, but finally, the line clicked over, and a deep, aggressively smooth voice filled the speakerphone in my office. Arthur Harrison. Make it fast. I'm stepping into a board meeting. Mr. Harrison, this is Nora Miller, owner of Apex Logistics. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of a heavy oak door closing. The background noise vanished. Ms. Miller, I was told you might call. I'm afraid our legal department has advised me not to engage in direct communication with your firm until the federal inquiry. Save the corporate Arthur. I cut him off, leaning into the microphone on the desk. I don't have time for it, and neither do you. I received your suspension notice this morning. Then you understand our position. It's purely a compliance issue. Nothing personal. It is entirely personal, I said, my voice dropping into a cold flat register. You're trying to cover your own tracks because you were too busy drinking scotch at the Historical Society galas to notice my mother robbing the vault you were supposed to be guarding. Excuse me? Harrison barked, his smooth veneer cracking instantly. You listen to me, young lady. Your mother is a criminal who defrauded an institution I have poured millions of dollars into. Do not presume to lecture me on oversight. I'm not lecturing you. I'm giving you a choice, I said. Right now, the IRS sees you as an incompetent treasurer who got played by an amateur. That's embarrassing, but it's not a crime. But if you try to use your corporate leverage to crush the logistics firm that voluntarily reported the fraud, it stops looking like incompetence. It starts looking like retaliation. It starts looking like you're trying to silence the whistleblowers because you were in on it. That is defamatory garbage, he roared. It's optics, Arthur. I fired back, not raising my voice an inch. And optics dictate stock prices. I have the Miller & Associates internal ledgers sitting in a secure server 30 feet from my desk. I have your digital signature on 42 separate approval memos authorizing LM, event management invoices. If you don't lift the suspension on my freight contracts in the next 10 minutes, I am sending unredacted copies of those memos to the Fairfield Business Times, the state attorney general, and the lead investigative reporter at the local news station. I will turn your quiet little embarrassment into a front-page scandal. The silence on the line was profound. I could hear him breathing, heavy and ragged. He was calculating the risk. He was used to bullying small-time vendors into submission, but he hadn't expected the vendor to be holding the very documents that could end his career. You wouldn't dare, he hissed. That's obstruction of a federal investigation. No, it's public disclosure of non-classified financial documents belonging to a public charity. Marcus chimed in smoothly from his chair. Perfectly legal and highly newsworthy. Harrison let out a long, slow exhalation that sounded like a tire-losing air. Your mother, Harrison said, his voice dripping with venom, was a manipulative, grasping parasite. I see the apple didn't fall far from the tree. The apple bought the orchard, Arthur, I said coldly. 10 minutes. Send the retraction email or I send the memos. I reached out and hit the end call button. Marcus looked at me, shaking his head slowly. You play rough, Nora. I learned from the best, I said, staring at the phone. Now we wait. 7 minutes later, my inbox pinged. It was an email from Harrison Manufacturing Procurement. The suspension was lifted. The trucks were cleared for dispatch. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, slumping back into my chair. The adrenaline drained out of me again, leaving me feeling hollowed out and jittery. Crisis averted, Mark said, standing up and stretching his back. Good work. But you know Harrison is going to look for any excuse to drop us when the contract is up for renewal next year. I know, I said. We'll find new clients by then. Tell dispatch to get the trucks moving. The rest of the day was a grueling marathon of damage control, reassuring other nervous clients, and coordinating the final document handover protocols with our legal team. By the time I left the office at 5:30, the sky had finally broken open. A steady driving rain turning the city streets into slick black mirrors. I drove home slowly, the windshield wipers thumping a steady rhythm. I was looking forward to a hot shower in silence. When I unlocked the door to my apartment, the smell of cheap takeout Chinese food hit me immediately. The lights in the kitchen were on. My dad was sitting at the island, eating lo mein out of a white carton with a plastic fork. He looked slightly better than he had the night before. He had shaved, and he was wearing a clean gray t-shirt he had unpacked from his duffel bag. Hey, he said, looking up as I walked in. I used the cash you left. Got extra egg rolls if you want some. Thanks, I said, dropping my bag on the couch and walking into the kitchen. I was starving, having entirely skipped lunch during the Harrison standoff. I grabbed a carton of beef and broccoli and a fork, sitting down on the stool across from him. We ate in silence for a few minutes. It was weirdly domestic, sitting in my high-rise apartment eating takeout with the man who had basically ignored my existence for a decade. Did you hear from anyone today? I asked finally, breaking the quiet. He stopped chewing, staring down at his noodles. Julian texted me around noon. I paused with my fork halfway to my mouth, and he said Mom left the house. My head snapped up. Left where? To the grocery store? No, my dad said, his voice dropping into that terrified whisper again. He said she packed 2 large suitcases, took her jewelry box, and called an Uber. She told him she wasn't going to stick around and be humiliated in front of the neighborhood when the federal agents showed up. She said she was going to Aunt Helen's place in Vermont. I stared at him, the beef and broccoli suddenly turning to ash in my mouth. She left the state, I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Dad, the IRS served the initial subpoenas to the firm on Tuesday. She knows there is an active federal investigation. If she crosses state lines with stolen assets, the jewelry, the cash she has, that's flight to avoid prosecution. I know, he whispered. And Julian? Where is he? He's still at the house, my dad said, looking up at me with wide panicked eyes. Nora, he's there alone. She left him there alone with the bank breathing down their necks and the audit 3 days away. I put my fork down. The plastic clattered against the quartz countertop, loud in the quiet kitchen. She left Julian. He said she didn't even say goodbye, my dad whispered, rubbing his hand over his face. She just told the Uber driver to hurry up and left him standing in the foyer. I stared at the half-eaten carton of food. It made perfect 6 sense. My mother didn't love her children. She loved the reflection of herself that she saw in us when we succeeded. When we failed or when we were no longer useful props in her stage place, we ceased to exist. Julian wasn't a son anymore. He was a liability. He was a 25-year-old kid with a useless degree and a stock portfolio funded by stolen charity money, sitting in a house that was about to be seized by the federal government. Did he say what he was going to do? I asked. He said he was trying to call Chloe, but she put her phone on Do Not Disturb. Then he asked if I could come back and help him figure out what to tell the bank. My dad looked up at me, his eyes leading. Nora, he doesn't know how to handle any of this. He doesn't even know how to pay the electric bill. She did everything for him. That was by design, Dad, I said, my voice hardening. She crippled him so he would never leave her. I know, but he's terrified. I looked at my father. He was terrified too. He was looking at me like I was the only adult in the room, which given the circumstances I was. I sighed, pushing the takeout carton away. The exhaustion that had settled into my bones earlier was suddenly replaced by a sharp cold focus. Stay here, I said, grabbing my keys off the counter for the second time that night. Where are you going? You can't go back there, Nora. If she comes back, she's not coming back, Dad. She's halfway to the Vermont border by now, trying to figure out how to hide her tennis bracelet from the IRS. I pulled my raincoat off the hook by the door. I'm going to get Julian. The drive back to the suburbs was worse in the rain. The highway was a slick black ribbon, the headlights of oncoming cars bleeding into the wet asphalt. By the time I turned into the cul-de-sac, it was past 8 o'clock. The neighborhood was quiet, the massive houses sitting back from the road, behind manicured hedges and perfectly lit driveways, except for my parents' house. The exterior floodlights were off. The house looked dark dead and entirely out of place among the glowing estates around it. My mother's SUV was gone. The only car in the driveway was Julian's leased BMW, sitting sideways near the garage doors like it had been parked by a drunk. I pulled up to the curb, killed the engine, and stepped out into the rain. The air was cold, smelling of wet pavement and damp earth. I walked up the driveway, the sound of my boots heavy in the quiet night. The front door was unlocked. It wasn't even fully shut. It was resting an inch ajar, the heavy brass latch completely disengaged. I pushed it open and stepped into the foyer. Julian, the house was freezing. The air conditioning was running at full blast, but the silence beneath the hum of the vents was absolute. The foyer looked like it had been hit by a localized hurricane. The antique console table was pushed away from the wall, a framed mirror above it hanging crookedly. There were deep scuff marks on the hardwood floor where heavy luggage had been dragged toward the door. Julian, I called out again, louder this time. A muffled sound came from the formal living room to the left. I walked through the archway, my boots squeaking slightly on the wood. The living room was a disaster. The custom leather sofas my dad had mentioned were pushed apart. The drawers of my mother's antique secretary desk had been pulled out and dumped onto the Persian rug. Bank statements, envelopes, and old tax returns were scattered everywhere, mixed with empty jewelry boxes. Julian was sitting in the middle of the mess on the floor. He was still wearing the designer linen shirt from the diner, but it was untucked and wrinkled. He had a half-empty bottle of my dad's cheap scotch in one hand and a stack of rip papers in the other. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. You're not supposed to be here, he mumbled, his tongue thick. Neither are you, I said, stepping over a pile of shredded bank envelopes. Put the bottle down, Julian. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the empty room. Why? Is it stolen too? Did she buy this with museum money? God, maybe I should just drink it all and throw up on the rug. Do you think the IRS will repossess the rug if it has puke on it? Get up, I ordered, ignoring his spiral. You need to pack a bag. You're leaving. I'm not leaving, he slurred, bringing the bottle to his mouth and taking a sloppy pull. This is my house. She said it was mine. She said when she and Dad downsized, I could have it. It's my inheritance. It's federal property as of tomorrow afternoon, I said bluntly. I walked over and snatched the bottle of scotch out of his hand. He didn't even fight me for it. His arm just dropped limply to his side. And if you're sitting here surrounded by shredded financial documents, when the field agents show up on Friday, they're going to arrest you for destruction of evidence. That seemed to pierce through the alcohol haze. Julian blinked, his head tilting up to look at me. What? Look around you, I said, gesturing to the absolute chaos of the room. She didn't just pack her bags, Julian. She tossed the office. She was looking for anything with her name on it to destroy, and she left you sitting in the middle of the crime scene. When the feds walk in here and see this, who do you think they're going to blame for the mess? The woman who is already in another state, or the guy sitting on the floor with the ripped bank statements? His face went pale, the flush of the alcohol draining away completely. I didn't rip them. She did. I was just trying to organize them. I was trying to figure out how much she actually took. It doesn't matter, I said. They don't care about your intentions. They care about what they can prove. Right now, they can prove you received wire transfers from a fraudulent shell company, and they can prove you were in the house when the financial records were destroyed. Get up. He scrambled to his feet, swaying slightly before catching his balance against the arm of the leather sofa. He looked around the room, really seeing it for the first time without the filter of his mother's presence. He saw the empty jewelry boxes. He saw the stripped desk. He saw the reality of his situation. Where did she go, Nora? He whispered, his voice cracking like a little boy's. Why did she leave me? Because she couldn't afford you anymore, I said. It was cruel, but it was the only language he was ever going to understand. Go upstairs. Pack enough clothes for a week. Your laptop, your chargers, your passport. Nothing else. Do not take anything she bought you with that account in the last 2 years. No watches, no electronics, just basic clothes. He nodded dumbly and stumbled past me out of the living room, his heavy footsteps echoing up the main staircase. I stayed downstairs, walking through the ground floor to make sure nothing else was actively burning or flooding. The kitchen was relatively clean, though the fridge was wide open, the light bulb burnt out inside. I walked over and pushed the heavy stainless steel door shut. On the kitchen island right next to the stove was a stack of unopened mail. I glanced at the top envelope. It was a final notice from a collection agency addressed to my mother dated 3 weeks ago. It wasn't for the Historical Society account. It was for a personal credit card. I flipped the rest of the pile. Past due notices for the landscaping company, a warning from the water department, a letter from a private loan servicer. She hadn't just been stealing to fund the extras. She had been stealing to keep the lights on, and even that hadn't been enough. The money from the museum was a band-aid on a massive bleeding arterial wound of debt. Nora? I turned around. Julian was standing at the bottom of the kitchen stairs, holding a medium-sized canvas weekender bag. He looked slightly more sober, the sheer panic of the situation burning through the scotch. I'm ready, he said quietly. Give me your keys, I said, holding out my hand. My keys? Why? Because your BMW is leased, Julian, and the payments come out of the joint account that was frozen this morning. If you try to drive it, the leasing company's GPS tracker is going to flag it, and they'll send a repo truck to my apartment building. You're riding with me. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the strap of his bag. That car was his pride and joy. He spent 3 hours every Sunday washing it in the driveway, making sure the neighbors saw him buffing the hood. Give me the keys, Julian, or stay here and wait for the feds. I really don't care which. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the sleek black fob, and dropped it onto the kitchen counter. The sound of the plastic hitting the granite felt incredibly final. Let's go, I said. We walked out the front door, and I pulled it shut behind us, listening to the heavy deadbolt click into place. I didn't bother turning on the exterior lights. I let the house sit in the dark, exactly as it deserved to be. Julian threw his bag into the back seat of my car and climbed into the passenger side. He didn't speak as I backed out of the driveway and pulled away from the curb. He just stared out the window, watching the neighborhood he had grown up in disappear into the rain. About halfway back to the city, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, and froze. Is it Mom? I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. It's Chloe, he muttered. He swiped the screen to answer and put the phone to his ear. Chloe, hey, where are you? I couldn't hear her words, but I could hear the pitch of her voice. It was frantic, high, and completely breathless. Julian's posture went rigid, his shoulders hiking up to his ears. Slow down, he said, pressing the phone harder against his ear. Chloe, slow down. What do you mean you're locked out? It's Tuesday. Your lease isn't up until the 30th. More frantic squawking from the other end. The landlord can't just change the locks, Julian argued, sounding out of his depth. That's illegal. Did you call the police? There was a pause, and then Julian's face drained of color for the second time that night. Wait, you used the routing number Mom gave you to pay this month's rent too? When? I let out a harsh sigh, my hands tightenings on the steering wheel. Chloe hadn't just used the stolen account for the condo down payment. She had been using it to pay her current rent too, which meant the transfer had bounced, and her landlord, who she was already leaving at the end of the month, had decided not to play games. Okay, just wait, Julian said, his voice shaking. Where are you right now? Are you in the hallway? hallway? He pulled the phone away from his ear and looked at me. Her landlord locked her out. The rent check bounced yesterday, and he slapped an eviction notice on the door and changed the deadbolt. She's sitting in the hallway with her purse and nothing else. Tell her to call a friend, I said flatly. She doesn't have any friends, Nora. She alienated all of them when she thought she was buying the penthouse. She has nowhere to go. She's sitting on the floor in her building. I looked over at him. He looked like a beaten dog. The arrogance, the entitlement, the smug little smirk he had worn on Saturday night while texting his stockbroker buddies. It was all completely gone. He was just a terrified kid realizing that the safety net was actually a spider web, and the spider had left town. Put her on speaker, I said. Julian tapped the screen and held the phone up. Chloe? I said loudly over the road noise. Nora? She sounded like she had been crying for hours. Nora, please, he won't let me in. All my clothes are in there. My work computer is in there. I have to log in tomorrow morning or I'll get fired. Where's your building? I asked. She rattled off an address in the trendy warehouse district, not far from my own office. Go down to the lobby. Wait inside the front doors. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Thank you, she sobbed, the sound wet and pathetic over the speaker. Thank you, Nora. I reached over and tapped the screen to end the call. The silence returned to the car, broken only by the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers. You don't have to do this, Julian said quietly, staring straight ahead at the rain. I know we didn't treat you right. You don't have to bail us out. I'm not bailing you out, I corrected him. I'm consolidating the liabilities. If I leave Chloe sitting in a hallway with a bounced check tied to a federal fraud investigation, she's going to panic, do something stupid, and draw local police attention to the family before my lawyers are ready for the IRS on Friday. I'm putting all of you in a box until Sarah Vance tells me what to do with you. Julian swallowed hard, but he didn't argue. He knew I was right. When we pulled up to Chloe's building, she was standing just inside the glass double doors of the lobby, looking like a drowned rat. She was wearing a thin silk blouse and expensive slacks, shivering visibly in the air conditioning. She didn't have an umbrella, and her hair was plastered to her forehead. She practically ran to my car when I unlocked the doors, sliding into the back seat and bringing the smell of expensive perfume and damp silk with her. My landlord is a psychopath, she hissed immediately, her teeth chattering. He just put a padlock on the door. He said if I try to break it, he's calling the cops. He's within his rights if the rent check bounced and you gave notice, I said, putting the car back in gear. You're lucky he didn't have your car towed. I don't have a car, she snapped defensively. I Uber everywhere. It's better for the environment. Right. Well, you're sleeping on my couch tonight, Chloe. Tomorrow you're going to call your office and tell them you have a family emergency, and you're taking the rest of the week off. I can't take the week off. I just started there 3 months ago. Then you're going to get fired, I said calmly, because by Friday morning, your face, Mom's face, and Julian's face are going to be on the local news when the Department of Justice unseals the indictments. You do not want to be sitting in a cubicle when that notification hits your coworkers' phones. The back seat went completely dead silent. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Chloe was staring at the back of my head, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. The reality of the public humiliation, the one thing my mother had taught them to fear above all else, was finally landing. The news, she whispered. Federal fraud involving a prominent local charity? Yes, Chloe. It's going to be page 1. I turned the car onto my street, the imposing structure of my apartment building rising up into the low clouds. I used my keycard to open the garage gate, the heavy metal grating rolling up to let us into the dry, brightly lit concrete bunker. I parked the car, killed the engine, and turned around to look at my brother and sister. Rules of the house, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet of the garage. Dad is upstairs. He is sleeping in the guest room. Do not talk to him about Mom. Do not talk to him about the money. He is filing for an innocent spouse petition to keep himself out of federal prison. And if either of you stresses him out and he has a heart attack, I will personally throw you off the balcony. They both nodded quickly, completely cowed. Second rule, I continued. You stay off social media. No posting, no vague posting, no liking pictures. You do not exist digitally until I say you do. Third rule, you do not contact Mom. If she calls you, you let it go to voicemail. Do you understand? Yes, Julian said softly. Chloe just nodded, chewing aggressively on her thumbnail. Good. Get your bag, Julian. Chloe, take your shoes off before you walk on my rugs. We rode the elevator up in silence. When I unlocked the door to my apartment, the lights in the kitchen were still on, but the living room was dark. The door to the guest room was firmly shut. The takeout cartons were neatly stacked in the recycling bin. The counters wiped down. Chloe stepped inside, pulling her wet shoes off and leaving them by the door. She looked around the massive, open concept space, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the modern art, the undeniable proof of the success she had spent years mocking. Wow, she breathed softly. Couch is yours, I told her, pointing to the massive sectional in the living room. There are blankets in the hall closet. Julian, there's a blow-up mattress in the storage room next to the laundry. Set it up in my office. Don't touch the files on my desk. I didn't wait to see if they followed instructions. I walked into my bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of my siblings moving around my apartment. 5 years ago, I had left that house with nothing but a duffel bag and a burning need to prove my mother wrong. I had built a fortress of independence, a life where I answered to no one and needed no one. And now, the entire shattered remnants of her fantasy world were sleeping under my roof. I walked over to the window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. The rain was coming down harder now, washing the city streets clean. Wednesday was coming. The lien on the house would be filed by noon. The bank accounts would be permanently seized. The dominoes were falling faster than even I had anticipated. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. I walked over and picked it up. It was an email from Marcus. The subject line was brief. Urgent morning prep. I opened the message. Nora, Vance called. The IRS field office didn't just accept the voluntary disclosure. They've expedited the review. They aren't waiting until Friday. They're serving the warrants tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We need to be at the Miller & Associates office by 8 a.m. to unlock the server room for the agents. Get some sleep. I looked at the digital clock on my dresser. It was 11:42 p.m. 9 hours. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The storm was here early. I didn't sleep. I just lay there on my back, watching the shadows of the rain tracking across the ceiling as the wind battered the glass. Every time I closed my eyes, my brain ran through the logistics of the next 24 hours. Server access codes, legal representations, press holding statements. The sheer volume of bureaucratic machinery that was about to drop on my family like an anvil. At 5:30, I gave up. I got out of bed, walked into my master bathroom, and took a shower so hot it turned my skin red. I dressed in my darkest, sharpest suit, a charcoal wool blend that felt like armor, and walked out into the living room. The apartment was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt like a waiting room. Chloe was a tangled mess on the sectional, the expensive cashmere throw blanket pulled up over her head. In the office down the hall, I could hear the faint, rhythmic squeak of the air mattress as Julian shifted in his sleep. My dad was awake. He was sitting at the kitchen island in the dark, a mug of black coffee cupped in his hands. He was wearing the same gray t-shirt from yesterday. He looked out the window at the city, the rain having faded into a thick, low-hanging mist that swallowed the tops of the buildings. You're up early, he said softly as I walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. The IRS moved the timeline up, I said, pulling out a bottle of water. They're serving the warrants at the Miller accounting office at 9. Marcus and I have to be there at 8 to let them in. My dad closed his eyes, his grip tightening around the coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. Okay, today's the day then. Today's the day, I confirmed. I leaned against the counter, looking at him. Sarah Vance is going to call my cell around noon once the initial asset freeze hit the federal registry. She'll have the innocent spouse paperwork ready ready for you to sign electronically. But Dad, you need to listen to me carefully. He opened his eyes and looked at me, his expression hollow. When that freeze hits, it hits everything with her name on it, I said. That means the joint checking account, the savings, the home equity line. The credit cards will start declining by lunchtime. Chloe and Julian's accounts are going to lock up too, because their deposits came from the flagged routing numbers. They are going to panic. They are going to realize they have absolutely $0 to their names. I can't help them, he whispered, staring down into his black face. I don't have a dime either. I know, and I don't want you trying. When they wake up and figure it out, you tell them to sit on that couch and wait for me to get home. Do not let them leave the apartment. Do not let them call Mom. If they try to move money around to a secondary app or a friend's account before the freeze fully propagates, they're committing bank fraud. Keep them here. He nodded slowly. I'll keep them here. I grabbed my briefcase, my keys, and my umbrella. I didn't say goodbye. There wasn't anything left to say. The drive to the Miller & Associates office park took 45 minutes in the morning commuter traffic. It was located in a bland, beige corporate strip in a wealthy suburb. The exact kind of invisible, boring architecture where white-collar crime thrives because nobody ever looks twice at it. Marcus was already waiting in the parking lot when I pulled in at 7:50. He was leaning against his sedan, holding 2 large paper cups of coffee and an umbrella. He looked as tired as I felt, his tie pulled loose, his glasses smudged. Morning, he said, handing me one of the cups as I walked up. Legal sent over the disclosure waivers. All we do is unlock the door, point them to the physical ledgers in the back room, and hand over the server administrator passwords. We do not answer questions about the clients. We just provide access. Understood, I said, taking a sip of the coffee. It was burnt, but I needed the caffeine. Are the other partners from Miller going to be here? No, Marcus said, shaking his head. I told them the building was closed for a plumbing issue. No need to have the civilian staff panicking while the feds copy their hard drives. It's just us. We unlocked the front doors and walked into the lobby. It smelled like stale carpet and cheap vanilla air freshener. The silence in the empty office felt heavy, expectant. We walked back to the central server room, a small climate-controlled closet in the center of the building, and waited. At exactly 8:45 a.m., 3 dark gray Ford Explorers pulled into the parking lot. They didn't use sirens. There were no flashing lights. It was terrifyingly quiet. 8 people got out of the vehicles. They were dressed in business casual clothes, khakis, button-downs, but they all wore navy blue windbreakers with the letters Iris CI printed in small, stark yellow font on the left breast. 2 of them were carrying flat, heavy-duty plastic evidence boxes. I watched them walk up to the glass doors through the lobby windows. Showtime, Marcus muttered. I pushed the front door open. The lead agent, a tall woman in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a completely neutral expression, stepped inside. Nora Miller, she asked, her voice calm and authoritative. Yes, this is my CFO, Marcus Thorne. She pulled a leather wallet from her pocket and flipped it open, displaying a gold badge. Special Agent Haskins, Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I have a federal warrant for the physical and digital records of this premises. She handed me a thick stack of folded paper. We are cooperating fully, Agent Haskins, I said, taking the warrant without looking at it. The server room is in the back. The physical ledgers for the Fairfield County Historical Society, as well as the LM event management files, are in the fireproof filing cabinet in Office 4. We've pulled the keys for you. Haskins looked at me, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. They were used to shouting, to shredding machines running in the background, to panicked accountants trying to delete hard drives. They weren't used to the owner holding the door open and offering a map. Thank you, Ms. Miller, Haskins said smoothly. She turned to her team. You heard her. Room 4 and the servers. Let's move. The agents filed past us. They were incredibly efficient. There was no drama, no tossing of desks. It was a clinical, highly organized extraction. 2 agents went into the server room and began plugging encrypted cloning drives into the network racks. 2 others went into Office 4 and started loading the physical ledgers, the very books my mother thought would stay buried forever, into the plastic bins. Marcus and I stood in the lobby for 3 hours. We didn't speak. The only sounds were the whirring of the server fans and the heavy footsteps of federal agents carrying my mother's lies out the front door in plastic tubs. At noon, Haskins walked back into the lobby, carrying a signed evidence manifest. She handed me the yellow carbon copy. We have what we need for the preliminary extraction, she said. The building is released back to your control, but the physical server hardware remains under subpoena. Do not attempt to wipe or replace it without clearance from our office. Understood, I said. She looked at me for a long second, her eyes dropping down to the name on the evidence manifest, then back up to my face. Your last name is Miller. The primary target of this investigation is a Linda Miller. Any relation? She's my mother, I said, keeping my voice completely flat. And my corporate counsel has already filed a voluntary disclosure regarding my firm's discovery of the fraud during our acquisition of this agency. I haven't spoken to her since the weekend. I don't plan to. Haskins gave a slow, measured nod. She didn't offer sympathy. She was a cop, and she recognized someone who was cutting dead weight to save their own ship. Keep your counsel close, Ms. Miller. The asset freezes are being executed through the federal banking system as we speak. It's going to be a messy week. She turned and walked out the door. The 3 gray SUVs pulled out of the parking lot a minute later, merging seamlessly into the suburban traffic, carrying $82,000 worth of federal felonies with them. It's done, Marcus said, letting out a long, heavy sigh. The liability is officially out of our hands. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It wasn't Sarah Vance. It was Julian. I stared at the screen for a second before answering. What is it, Julian? Nora. His voice was high-tight, bordering on hyperventilation. Nora, my app is locked. The brokerage app. I tried to log in to check the pre-market on that tech stock, and it threw a red error code. It says account frozen, federal compliance hold. I called the customer service line, and they wouldn't even talk to me. They just read me a scripted legal statement and hung up. The asset freeze. It was moving faster than I thought. I told you yesterday, Julian. The money was stolen. The IRS is clawing it back. But they froze my checking account too, he shouted, the panic fully taking over. My personal checking. I only have $400 in there, Nora. It's from my birthday last year. It's not Mom's money. It doesn't matter, I said, walking out to my car and getting in, shutting the door against the damp air. The money from Mom touched that account when she transferred the portfolio funds. In the eyes of the federal government, the whole account is tainted until the forensic audit proves otherwise. That takes months. You have $0, Julian. I can't have $0, he screamed, sounding like a toddler who had just dropped his ice cream. I have a car payment. I have a gym membership. My phone bill auto-drafts tomorrow. Cancel the gym. Let the phone bill bounce. And the car's going back to the dealership anyway, I said coldly. Don't leave the apartment. I hung up on him. I didn't have the patience for his temper tantrum. I put the car in reverse and started the drive back to the city. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Chloe. I put it on speaker and dropped it into the cup holder. Chloe, if this is about your bank accounts, I already talked to Julian. Nora, I'm at the coffee shop downstairs, she whispered. She was crying. Not the theatrical, performative crying my mother used to get her way. This was real, ugly, humiliating weeping. I came down to get a latte and a bagel. My debit card declined. I tried my credit card. It declined. The barista tried it 3 times, Nora. The line was all the way out the door, and everyone was staring at me. I tried to use Apple Pay, and it said my card was invalid. The manager had to come over and ask me to step out of the line. I stared at the highway markers passing by. The cruelty of it wasn't lost on me. Chloe had spent her entire life judging people by what they wore, where they drank coffee, what kind of bag they carried. Her entire identity was tied to the illusion of wealth. To have a card decline for a $6 coffee in front of a line of city professionals was her version of a public execution. execution. Go back upstairs, Chloe, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, though I refused to coddle her. Dad has a $20 bill on the counter. Use it if you need food. Don't try to use your cards again. If you keep triggering the fraud alerts, the bank is going to flag you as a flight risk. I don't understand, she sobbed. I didn't do anything wrong. Mom gave me that money. I didn't know it was from the museum. Ignorance isn't a defense against asset forfeiture, I said. Go upstairs. Do not leave the building again. I ended the call and drove the rest of the way in silence. My family had been completely financially neutralized in the span of 3 hours. The kingdom of playing cards hadn't just fallen. It had been vacuumed up into a federal evidence locker. When I walked into the Apex Logistics office on the 4th floor, the atmosphere was distinctly different from the Miller building. The warehouse was humming, the phones were ringing, and my administrative staff was moving around with purpose. It was a functioning, legitimate business, a stark contrast to the graveyard I had just left. Elena walked up to my desk before I even sat down. Sarah Vance called twice, she said, handing me a pink message slip. And you have a voicemail on the private line. It's not a client, it's a woman named Helen. She said she's your aunt. She sounded extremely upset. I stopped in my tracks. Helen was my mother's older sister. She lived in a massive, isolated frame cabin in Vermont, funded by a divorce settlement she got in the late 90s. Helen wasn't malicious like my mother, but she was weak, easily manipulated, and perfectly happy to look the other way if my mother was picking up the check for dinner. I took the slip from Elena, walked into my office, and shut the door. I sat down at my desk, picked up the receiver, and dialed the Vermont number. Helen picked up on the first ring. Hello, Aunt Helen, it's Nora. Nora. Oh, thank God, she gasped, her voice trembling. Nora, what is going on? Your mother showed up here at 2 in the morning. She took an Uber all the way from Connecticut. She cost me $800 in cash to pay the driver because she said her cards weren't working. Her cards aren't working because the federal government froze them, Helen, I said, leaning back in my chair. She stole $80,000 from the Historical Society. The IRS raided her accounting firm this morning. There was a dead, terrifying silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of wind blowing through the pine trees outside her cabin. Stole? Helen whispered. Federal? Nora, she told me Richard had a gambling problem. She told me she had to leave the house because the bank was foreclosing on him, and she needed a place to stay while the divorce lawyers sorted it out. I closed my eyes. Even on the run, she couldn't stop lying. She was perfectly willing to burn my father's reputation to the ground just to buy herself a few days of sympathy on a couch in Vermont. Dad doesn't gamble, I said. Mom is the one under indictment. The warrants were executed 4 hours ago. Oh my God, Helen breathed. Oh my God, Nora, she's in my guest room right now. She's been drinking my wine since breakfast. And she asked me to go to the bank. I sat up straight, the leather chair squeaking loudly. To do what? She said she needed cash to pay a retainer for a lawyer, Helen said, her voice rising in panic. She told me to wire $50,000 from my savings account into a crypto exchange app she downloaded on my iPad. I told her my bank wouldn't clear a wire that big without me going into the branch, and she started screaming at me. She threw a coffee mug at the wall, Nora. It shattered everywhere. Helen listened to me very carefully, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly serious tone. Do not go to the bank. Do not wire her a single dime. If you transfer money to her, or if you use your accounts to hide her assets, you are actively participating in wire fraud and aiding a fugitive. The IRS will seize your cabin. I didn't wire anything, Helen cried. I was too scared. The bank actually called me an hour ago. They said there was a flagged transaction attempted from my IP address. They asked if I authorized a $10,000 transfer to an offshore account. I told them no, and they froze my iPad. My mother was desperately trying to siphon money out of her sister's accounts to fund a run. She wasn't just a thief anymore. She was a cornered rat, biting whoever was closest to her. She tried to steal from you while she was sleeping in your guest room, Helen, I said. You need to get her out of that house. I can't, she sobbed. I'm terrified of her. She's pacing around the living room muttering to herself. She looks crazy, Nora. You have to come get her. Please, you're the only one she'll listen to. She doesn't listen to me, Helen. She hates me because I caught her. I looked out the window at the docks, the cranes moving heavy shipping containers in the gray afternoon light. I am not driving to Vermont. I'm running a company, and I'm currently housing the rest of the family she abandoned. You have 2 choices. You walk into the living room and tell her to leave, or you call the state police and tell them an indicted federal fugitive is currently trespassing in your home and destroying your property. I can't call the police on my own sister, Helen whimpered. Then she's going to drain your bank accounts the minute you fall asleep, I replied brutally. And when the federal marshals figure out where she is, which they will, because they track the Uber receipts, they are going to arrest you for harboring her. I have to go, Helen. Lock your bedroom door. I hung up the phone. My heart was beating entirely too fast. I stood up and walked out to the administrative floor. Alina, I need Sarah Vance on the line right now. Alina nodded, her fingers flying across her switchboard. A minute later, the red light on my desk phone blinked. I walked back into my office and picked it up. Sarah, it's Normus Miller. I was just reviewing the asset freeze documentation the IRS forwarded. The lawyer said smoothly. Your father's petition is drafted. I just need him to sign the electronic closures freeze. How are the siblings holding up under the freeze? They're panicking, but they're contained, I said. That's not why I'm calling. I just got off the phone with my aunt in Vermont. My mother is at her house. She tried to initiate a $10,000 offshore wire transfer using my aunt's iPad, and she's trying to pressure her into liquidating $50,000 more in cash. Sarah Vance was silent for exactly 2 seconds. The sound of her pen tapping against her desk stopped entirely. Did the $10,000 wire clear? Vance asked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual professional warmth. No. My aunt's bank flagged it and locked the device. Thank God for small-town banking algorithms, Vance muttered. Nora, this changes the operational reality. Trying to move assets offshore while under active federal investigation isn't just structuring or embezzlement. It elevates the risk profile to international flight. If the IRS regional director gets wind of that attempted wire, they won't just send a summons in the mail. They will issue an immediate federal arrest warrant, and the U.S. Marshals will go pick her up. Good, I said. Let them. It's not that simple, Vance cautioned. If she gets arrested for attempted flight, the innocent spouse petition for your father becomes infinitely harder to process. The prosecution will argue that she was trying to hide the money for the benefit of the family unit. We need her to stay put and surrender quietly. We need her to look like a cooperative, albeit guilty, suburban housewife, not a cartel money launderer. She's not going to surrender quietly, Sarah. She threw a coffee mug at her sister's head this morning. Then we need to force her hand, Vance said. I am going to contact the lead investigator at the IRSCI field office right now. I will inform them of her location in Vermont as a show of absolute cooperation from our side. It bolsters your father's defense. But you need to understand, once I make this call, the timeline is out of our hands. They could show up at your aunt's cabin in 3 days, or they could show up in 3 hours. Make the call, I said without hesitation. I hung up and sat in my quiet office, listening to the hum of the warehouse below. It was 2 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. By Friday, the woman who had spent 30 years making me feel like I was nothing would be sitting in a concrete room wearing a jumpsuit. I left the office at 5. The rain had stopped, leaving the city air smelling of ozone and wet exhaust. I stopped at a high-end grocery store on the way back to my apartment, buying enough food to feed 3 adults for the next week. I didn't want any of them leaving the building to go to a restaurant, and I didn't want a parade of delivery drivers coming to my floor. When I unlocked my apartment door, the tension hit me like a physical wall of heat. Julian was pacing the length of the living room, his phone glued to his ear, arguing in hushed, frantic tones. Chloe was sitting at the kitchen island, staring blankly at a legal pad where she had clearly been trying to write down a budget. Given that she had no income and no savings, it was a short list. My dad was sitting in the armchair by the window, staring at the television, which was muted. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes darting toward the heavy grocery bags in my hands. "I'll take those," he said quickly, standing up and crossing the room to help me. It was a nervous gesture, the desperate desire to be useful, to prove he wasn't a burden. "Thanks," I said, slipping my coat off. Julian ended his call and turned to me, his face a mask of furious anxiety. "I just got off the phone with my leasing company. They won't take a credit card over the phone because the primary name on the account is flagged. They want a certified cashier's check by tomorrow morning, or they're issuing a repo order for the BMW." "Then they're issuing a repo order," I said, walking into the kitchen and opening the fridge. "Let them take it." "I can't let them take it," he yelled, his voice cracking. "It's my car. If I get a repo on my credit report, I'm ruined. I won't be able to rent an apartment. I won't be able to get a job." "Julian, you have an $80,000 federal fraud investigation tied to your checking account," I said, turning around to face him. "A car repossession is the least of your problems. Nobody is renting you an apartment anyway." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked toward Chloe for support, but she just kept staring at her legal pad, entirely consumed by her own misery. "You don't care," Julian spat, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You're enjoying this. You've been waiting for this since we were kids. You sit in your fancy glass apartment and you watch us drown, and you don't even care. I'm paying a corporate defense attorney $600 an hour to make sure your father doesn't die in a federal prison," I said, my voice dangerously low. "I let you sleep in my office so you didn't get arrested for obstruction of justice. I picked your sister up off the floor of a hallway. Do not talk to me about what I enjoy." Julian stepped back, the fight draining out of him instantly. He collapsed onto the edge of the sectional, putting his head in his hands. I don't know what to do," he mumbled into his palms. "I don't know how to fix it." "You can't fix it," I said, the anger fading into a cold, practical exhaustion. "That's the point. Mom broke it so thoroughly that it cannot be fixed. You just have to survive the crash." My phone rang in my pocket. The sharp electronic trill cut through the quiet of the apartment. Everyone froze. My dad stopped putting the milk in the fridge. Chloe looked up from her legal pad. Julian raised his head. I pulled the phone out. The caller ID was a standard cell phone number with a Vermont area code. It wasn't Aunt Helen's landline. I knew exactly who it was. She had bought a burner phone. I stared at the screen, letting it ring. 2 rings. 3. "Is it her?" my dad whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. I didn't say hello. I just listened. "Nora." Her voice was entirely different from the screaming banshee I had left in the driveway yesterday. It was low, raspy, and incredibly controlled. The theatricality was gone. This was the real Linda Miller, stripped of her audience and operating on pure survival instinct. "Mom," I said. The entire apartment stopped breathing. Julian stood up slowly. Chloe covered her mouth with her hand. "Helen locked herself in the master bathroom," my mother said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "She won't come out. She said you told her not to give me the money. She said you threatened her with the police." I told her the truth, I said, walking away from the kitchen and into the living room, looking out the massive windows at the city below. "If she helps you, she's an accessory, and the federal marshals aren't going to care that she's your sister." There was a long pause on the line. I could hear a car engine running in the background. "She wasn't in the cabin anymore. She was moving. Where's your father?" she asked. The question wasn't affectionate. It was a tactical inquiry. "He's safe," I said. "He signed the innocent spouse paperwork an hour ago. Sarah Vance filed it with the regional director. He's formally cooperating with the investigation." I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath. It was the sound of a woman realizing her human shield had just walked off the battlefield. "He's cooperating," she repeated, the word tasting like poison in her mouth. "After 30 years, he's going to stand up in a courtroom and tell them I did it alone." "Because you did do it alone, Mom. You wrote the checks. You forged his signature on the routing documents. You bought the jewelry. I built the life he wanted," she snapped, a flash of the old rage breaking through the cold control. "I gave you all the life you wanted. You think those suburban neighbors respected him? A utility worker with dirt under his nails? I made us respectable. I made sure Julian and Chloe had the right clothes, the right friends. I gave them a future. I did what I had to do. You bought a stage and you made us play the roles you assigned us," I corrected her, my voice steady. "And the minute the stage caught fire, you left Julian sitting in the middle of it. Where are you right now, Mom? Don't play detective with me, Nora," she hissed. "I know what you're doing. You think you've won. You think you've finally beaten me. But you have no idea what you're dealing with. The Historical Society isn't the only account I managed." The coldness in her voice suddenly sent a chill down the back of my neck. I stopped looking at the window and turned back toward the room. "What does that mean?" I demanded. "It means Arthur Harrison isn't as clean as he pretends to be," she said, a cruel, satisfied smile audible in her tone. "It means the deferred compensation structure wasn't just my idea. And it means if I go down, I am taking half the board of directors with me. And they know it." "Mom, I need $50,000, Nora," she interrupted, her voice dropping into a flat, demanding register. "Not from Helen. From you. From your little logistics company. You have the cash. You wire it to the offshore account number I'm going to text you right now." "I'm not wiring you a dime," I said flatly. "You're delusional. If you don't wire the money by midnight," she continued as if I hadn't spoken, "I will call the local business journals myself. I will tell them that Apex Logistics didn't discover the fraud. I will tell them that Apex Logistics helped me launder the money for the last 3 years. I will tell them you set up the Delaware holding company specifically to hide the Historical Society funds, and that Arthur Harrison used your trucks to move undocumented assets across state lines." The silence in my apartment was absolute. I stared at the wall, my brain rapidly processing the threat. It was a lie, a massive, easily disprovable lie, but a lie told to a federal investigator during a highly publicized local scandal would trigger an automatic, mandatory freeze of my corporate accounts pending verification. It would take months to clear my name. The manufacturing plants would cancel their contracts instantly. My business, the one pure, clean thing I had built from the ground up, would be crippled before the truth ever came out. She knew exactly where my throat was, and she was going for it. "You wouldn't," I whispered. "Try me," she said smoothly. "Midnight, Nora. Check your messages." The line went dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the black screen until a text notification lit it up. It was a string of digits, an offshore routing number based in the Cayman Islands, followed by a single word. Midnight. My dad was watching me, his hands resting heavily on the kitchen counter. Julian and Chloe hadn't moved. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like I had to push through it just to breathe. "What did she want?" my dad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. $50,000, I said, my voice completely flat. "Or she tells the local press and the IRS that my logistic company was her money laundering front." Julian gasped, a sharp, pathetic sound. Chloe put her head down on her legal pad and started crying again, her shoulders shaking violently. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just unlocked my phone, took a screenshot of the text message, and opened my email. I attached the screenshot, typed out a brief 2-sentence summary of the extortion threat, and sent it directly to Sarah Vance and Marcus. Then I walked back into the kitchen, pulled a clean glass from the cabinet, filled it with tap water, and drank it. "Are you gonna pay it?" Julian asked, staring at me like I was an alien. "Nora, if she goes to the press, she'll ruin you. She'll ruin everything you built. You have the money. Just pay her." "I'm not paying her a dime," I said, setting the glass down. "I'm going to let her dig the rest of the hole." My phone rang 10 minutes later. It was Sarah Vance. "Tell me you didn't reply," she said the second I answered. "I didn't reply." "Good. I just forwarded your email to Agent Haskins at the IRS CI field office and ICC the regional director. Extorting a witness across state lines to fund international flight while under active federal investigation. Your mother isn't just a white-collar amateur anymore, Nora. She just made herself a priority target. Can she still tank my company? I asked, looking out the window at the city light. No, Sarah said, and I could hear the grim, professional satisfaction in her voice. Because by reporting the extortion attempt immediately in writing, you've preemptively immunized Apex Logistics. Haskins is securing a protective order for your corporate accounts as we speak. They know exactly what she's doing. If your mother calls the press tomorrow, it won't trigger an audit on your firm. It'll just add an obstruction charge to her federal indictment. You're bulletproof, Nora. Go to sleep. Thank you, Sarah. I hung up the phone and turned around to face my family. They were all staring at me, waiting for the verdict. It's over, I said. The feds have the extortion threat. My company is shielded. Mom has absolutely no leverage left. I didn't wait to see their reactions. I walked into my bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. I got into bed, pulled the covers up, and closed my eyes. For the first time in a week, I slept through the night. I didn't even dream. Midnight came and went. The sky didn't fall. The trucks didn't stop running. I woke up at 6 on Thursday morning to the sound of my alarm. I made coffee, showered, and got dressed for work. When I walked out into the living room, Chloe was still asleep on the couch. Julian was gone, but the door to the guest room was open, and my dad was sitting on the edge of the mattress, staring at his phone. He looked up when I walked past. His face was entirely unreadable. They got her, he said. I stopped in the hallway. When? 3 in the morning, he rasped, turning the phone around so I could see the screen. It was a digital alert from the local Fairfield County news station. Aunt Helen called the state police when Mom tried to smash a window in the living room to get to her car keys. The state troopers held her until the federal marshals arrived. Helen just texted me. She said Mom was screaming the whole time. She fought the troopers. They had to put her in handcuffs on the front lawn. I looked at the headline on the screen. Local Historical Society chair arrested in Vermont on federal fraud extortion charges. There was no picture yet, just a generic graphic of a gavel. But the reality was right there in black and white text. The theatrical production was officially canceled. Are you okay? I asked him. He let out a long, shuddering breath, dropping the phone onto the bed. I feel like I just woke up from a 30-year coma, Nora. I feel sick, but I don't feel scared anymore. Good, I said. Sarah Vance will call you this afternoon to finalize the innocent spouse petition. Stay here today. I'll see you tonight. I went to the office. The day was surprisingly quiet. Marcus handled the final document transfers with the IRS, and the Harrison manufacturing trucks rolled out of our loading bays exactly on schedule. The local business journals picked up the story of my mother's arrest by lunchtime, but Apex Logistics wasn't mentioned in a single article. We were completely insulated. I had successfully amputated the rotting limb before the infection could spread. When I got home at 6 o'clock, the apartment was tense. The reality of the news had finally settled over Julian and Chloe. They were sitting at the kitchen island, staring at their phones, realizing that the frozen accounts weren't a glitch. The money was never coming back. The condo was gone. The BMW was gone. Their mother was sitting in a federal holding cell, and they had absolutely nothing. I dropped my keys on the counter and opened my briefcase. I pulled out 2 thin plastic folders and set them down on the granite island, right in front of my siblings. Julian frowned, looking at the blue folder. What is this? Open it, I said. He flipped the plastic cover back. Inside were 3 printed paper applications. One for a local grocery store, one for a corporate coffee chain, and one for a warehouse sorting position at a competitor's logistics firm. Chloe opened hers. It was exactly the same. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling with rising indignation. Are you serious? You want me to apply to be a barista? I have a degree in marketing. You have a degree you barely passed, and you got your last job because Mom bribed the hiring manager with a catered lunch, I said, my voice cold and entirely devoid of sympathy. Your accounts are frozen. Your rent bounced. You have 30 days to find a way to pay for your own life because you are not living in my apartment past Sunday. Julian stared at the grocery store application, his face flushing dark red. You're kicking us out? Nora, I don't even have a car. Take the bus, I said. It builds character. Chloe burst into tears, shoving the folder away from her. You're a sociopath. You're enjoying this. You've been waiting to do this to us. No, Chloe, I said, leaning over the counter so I was eye level with her. Mom did this to you. She handed you a fantasy on a silver platter, and you were too lazy and too arrogant to ask where the silver came from. When she handed me applications for minimum wage mall jobs in front of the entire family on my 18th birthday, you laughed. You thought it was hilarious. Well, the joke's over. Welcome to the real world. You need tough love to survive it. I turned my back on them and walked into my bedroom. I didn't care if they cried. I didn't care if they screamed. I had carried their dead weight for a week to protect my father and my company, and my obligations were officially complete. By Sunday morning, they were gone. Julian swallowed his pride and called a friend from college, begging for a spot on a futon in a cramped apartment downtown. Chloe packed her silk blouses into a duffel bag and took an Uber to a cheap motel near the interstate, using the last of the cash my dad had given her. They didn't say goodbye. I didn't expect them to. My dad stayed with me for another 2 weeks. When the bank formally seized the house in Fairfield County, he didn't even flinch. We found him a quiet 1-bedroom apartment in a blue-collar neighborhood on the edge of the city. I paid the first and last month's rent in cash, and he took a part-time job at a local hardware store to cover his groceries. He looked older, his hair completely gray now, but the heavy, suffocating anxiety that had hovered around him for 3 decades was gone. He was finally breathing his own air. My mother's trial didn't happen. She took a plea deal 4 months later. Wire fraud, tax evasion, and interstate extortion. She was sentenced to 6 years in a minimum security federal facility in Danbury. I didn't go to the sentencing hearing. I didn't read the transcript of her statement to the judge. I just let her fade into the background noise of the criminal justice system. It was mid-October when I finally felt the absolute weight of it all lift off my shoulders. I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment, a glass of red wine in my hand, watching the city lights come on against the autumn sky. The air was crisp and cold. Below me, the traffic moved in endless glowing rivers of white and red. My company had just closed its most profitable quarter in history. My dad had come over for dinner the night before, and we had actually laughed about a joke he heard at the hardware store. It was simple. It was quiet. I took a slow sip of the wine, letting the silence of the apartment wash over me. There were no theatrical toasts. There were no plastic folders, no fake rays, no stolen money. There was just the life I had built with my own 2 hands, entirely real and entirely mine. I had survived the fire, and as I looked out over the city, I realized I wasn't cold anymore.